Sometimes the bond between a man and his horse runs deeper than blood. When everything you've worked for hangs by a thread, you discover who truly stands by your side. In Deadman's Bluff, rancher Samuel Creek faces the gallows for a murder he didn't commit. The evidence points to him. The town wants justice, and the noose awaits. But his mustang Dustfire knows something the people don't. As Samuel stands on the platform with his final breath approaching, Dustfire breaks free and charges toward the gallows. What this loyal horse does next will change everything the town believes about justice and truth. Can an animal's love for his master overcome human judgment? And when all hope seems lost, who decides what's really right? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Deadman's Bluff earned its name the hard way. Perched on a rocky outcropping that overlooked the endless stretch of desert below, the town had seen more than its share of souls meet their maker at the end of a rope. The gallows stood at the center of the dusty main street, like a grim monument to frontier justice, its weathered wood bleached white by the relentless sun. Samuel Creek had never imagined he'd be the next to climb those 13 steps. He sat in the cramped jail cell, rolling his father's lucky silver dollar between his fingers, a habit that had comforted him through 43 years of hard living. The coin was smooth now, worn thin by countless worried moments, but it still caught what little light filtered through the barred window. Outside, he could hear Dustfire pacing. The mustang hadn't left his post since Samuel's arrest 3 days ago. Sheriff Wade Morrison had tried to move the horse to the stable twice, but Dustfire would have none of it. The animal stood vigil in the narrow alley beside the jail, occasionally nickering softly, as if trying to communicate something urgent that humans were too stubborn to understand. Samuel had found Dustfire as a yearling colt, wild-eyed and half-starved after rustlers had scattered his herd. Most folks would have seen nothing but trouble in that scraggly animal, all ribs and defiance. But Samuel recognized something in those dark eyes, a spirit that matched his own restless soul. He'd spent weeks earning the horse's trust, offering water and grain without trying to rope or corner him. When Dustfire finally allowed Samuel to approach, it wasn't surrender, it was partnership. That had been 8 years ago, back when Samuel first settled in the valley outside Deadman's Bluff. He'd drifted for most of his adult life, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, earning enough to drink away the loneliness before moving on to the next job. But something about this harsh, beautiful country called to him. Maybe it was the way the morning light painted the desert rocks gold, or how the evening stars seemed close enough to pluck from the purple sky. More likely, it was the simple exhaustion of being nobody nowhere for too long. So he'd built a modest ranch in the shadow of Copper Canyon, running cattle on land that nobody else wanted. The work was brutal, water was scarce, predators were plentiful, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. But it was his work, on his land, building something that would outlast him. For the first time in his life, Samuel Creek had put down roots. The townspeople of Deadman's Bluff had welcomed him with the cautious acceptance reserved for newcomers who proved they could stick. Sheriff Morrison was a fair man who appreciated Samuel's willingness to help track rustlers. Judge Harlan Pierce respected his honesty in business dealings. Martha Caldwell, who ran the Dusty Rose Saloon, enjoyed their chess games and philosophical conversations over coffee. Samuel had earned his place in their community through 8 years of honest work. He paid his debts, helped his neighbors, and never caused trouble. When the widow Henderson's barn burned down, he'd spent 2 weeks rebuilding it without accepting a dime. When young Tommy Watson got lost in a spring blizzard, Samuel and Dustfire had tracked the boy for 2 days until they found him huddled in a cave, half frozen but alive. That was the Samuel Creek that Deadman's Bluff knew, or thought they knew. But now they saw only the evidence. His gun found beside Theodore Blackwood's body, his horse's distinctive hoofprints in the mud near the merchant's store, a witness who claimed to have seen Samuel arguing with Blackwood the day before the murder. The fact that Samuel had no solid alibi for the time of the killing, he'd been alone on his ranch, as usual, tending to a sick calf. Theodore Blackwood had been many things: successful, influential, wealthy, but beloved was not among them. The merchant had arrived in Deadman's Bluff 5 years earlier with money to invest and an eye for opportunity. He'd bought the general store, expanded it, brought in goods from back east that folks didn't know they wanted until they saw them. Blackwood had a talent for making money and an even greater talent for making enemies. Still, murder was murder, and in a town where justice came swift and final, circumstantial evidence was often enough to seal a man's fate. The silver dollar slipped from Samuel's fingers and rolled across the cell floor, coming to rest against the far wall. As he bent to retrieve it, he heard Dustfire's familiar whinny, not the usual greeting, but something more urgent, something that sounded almost like a warning. Samuel moved to the window and peered through the bars. The mustang stood in the alley, head raised, ears forward, staring toward the main street with an intensity that made Samuel's skin prickle. Dustfire possessed an intelligence that went beyond normal horse sense. He could read weather patterns 2 days out, could find water in country that looked bone dry, could sense a rattlesnake's presence from 50 yards away. Right now, every line of the horse's body spoke of danger approaching. "Easy, boy," Samuel whispered, though he knew Dustfire couldn't hear him through the thick adobe walls. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. In 18 hours, Samuel Creek would climb those 13 steps to the gallows. Judge Pierce had made it clear that the trial was a formality, the evidence was overwhelming, and the town demanded justice for Blackwood's murder. But as Samuel watched his faithful companion maintain his lonely vigil in the alley, he felt a flicker of something he'd thought was lost forever. Not hope, exactly that was a luxury he couldn't afford, but certainty. After 8 years together, he knew Dustfire better than he knew himself, and right now the mustang was telling him that the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The shadows were growing longer as afternoon faded toward evening. Soon, the town would settle into its nightly routine, except tonight would be different. Tonight, Deadman's Bluff would prepare for its first execution in 3 years. The gallows would be inspected, the rope tested, the crowd controlled. Samuel pressed his face against the bars one more time, catching sight of Dustfire's proud profile silhouetted against the dying light. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least he wouldn't die alone. At least one soul in this God-forsaken town still believed in his innocence. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. 3 mornings earlier, Samuel had ridden into town for supplies, Dustfire picking his way carefully down the rocky trail that led from Copper Canyon to the valley floor. The September air carried the first hint of autumn, and Samuel was thinking about the cattle drive he'd need to organize before winter set in. He was thinking about ordinary things: salt for the cattle, ammunition for his rifle, maybe a new pair of boots if Martha had gotten that shipment from Denver she'd been expecting. He wasn't thinking about death. Theodore Blackwood's body lay sprawled behind his general store in a pool of congealed blood, face down in the dirt with a single bullet hole in his back. Samuel discovered it purely by accident. He'd been walking around to the store's rear entrance, looking for Blackwood's clerk, when the front door was locked tight at 10 in the morning. The scream that tore from his throat brought half the town running. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around the grisly scene, and Samuel found himself staring down at a man he'd had harsh words with just the day before, words that suddenly seemed prophetic and damning. "You're bleeding this town dry, Blackwood," he'd said, standing in the middle of the merchant's store while other customers pretended not to listen. "Charging folks double what supplies are worth just because you can. There's going to be a reckoning someday." Now Blackwood was dead, and Samuel's reckoning had arrived with interest. Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. Wade Morrison had been keeping the peace in Deadman's Bluff for 15 years, and he'd developed a nose for trouble that rarely steered him wrong. But as he knelt beside Blackwood's body, his expression was that of a man who wished he'd been wrong this time. "Nobody touch anything," Morrison commanded, standing and scanning the crowd. His eyes lingered on Samuel for a moment too long. "Doc Henderson, you examine the body. Rest of you folks clear out and let us work." Samuel started to back away with the others, but Morrison's voice stopped him cold. "Not you, Samuel. I need to ask you some questions." The words hit like a physical blow. Samuel felt the crowd's attention shift to him, curious murmurs rippling through the assembled townspeople. He'd found the body that made him a witness, but the sheriff's tone suggested something more serious than routine questioning. "When did you last see Theodore alive?" Morrison asked, pulling out a small notebook. "Yesterday afternoon. Had words with him about his prices." Samuel's mouth felt dry as dust. "But you know how Blackwood was, Sheriff. Plenty of folks had words with him." Morrison nodded, scribbling notes. "What about this morning? Where were you around sunrise?" "At my ranch, tending to a sick calf." Samuel's unease was growing by the second. "Sheriff, what's this about?" Before Morrison could answer, his deputy came jogging around the corner of the building, holding something that made Samuel's blood turn to ice water. It was a Colt .45 revolver. Samuel's Colt .45 revolver, the one with his initials carved into the wooden grip. "Found this in the weeds about 20 yards from the body," Deputy Collins announced, holding the gun by the barrel. "Looks like it's been fired recently." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Samuel stared at the weapon in disbelief. He'd last seen that gun in his saddlebags when he'd left the ranch that morning. Or had he? In the chaos of discovering Blackwood's body, he couldn't remember checking his gear. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "I never drew that gun. I never—" "Samuel Creek," Sheriff Morrison said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of murder." The words seemed to come from a great distance. Samuel felt the world tilt sideways as Deputy Collins approached with shackles. This couldn't be happening. He was a respected member of the community. He'd never killed a man in cold blood. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But the evidence spoke louder than his protests. As the deputy fastened the iron cuffs around his wrists, Samuel heard a commotion from the street. Dustfire had somehow worked free from his hitching post and was trotting toward the crowd, ears pinned back, eyes wide with agitation. The mustang pushed through the gathered townspeople like they were tumbleweeds, ignoring their shouts and grabbing hands. "Whoa there, boy," Samuel called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Easy." But Dustfire wasn't easy. The horse circled the crime scene, snorting and pawing at the ground, his attention focused not on Samuel but on something else entirely, something the humans had missed. Dustfire kept returning to a spot near the store's back door, lowering his head to sniff at the ground, then raising it to stare toward the hills beyond town. "Get that animal out of here," Judge Pierce commanded, having arrived to survey the scene. "He's disturbing evidence." But as two men moved to grab Dustfire's reins, the mustang danced away, continuing his agitated circuit around Blackwood's body. His behavior was unlike anything Samuel had seen before, not panic, but something more purposeful, something that looked almost like investigation. "He knows something," Samuel said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Look at him, Sheriff. Dustfire's trying to tell us something." Morrison studied the horse for a long moment, then shook his head. "He's upset because his master's in trouble, that's all." They loaded Samuel into the back of the sheriff's wagon for the short ride to jail. As the wheels began to turn, he twisted around for one last look at the scene. Dustfire stood alone now, the crowd having dispersed, still staring toward the distant hills with an intensity that made Samuel's heart ache. The mustang knew something. Samuel was certain of it. But in a world where evidence mattered more than instinct, where justice moved as swift and final as a summer thunderstorm, what did it matter what a horse might know? Inside the jail, the iron door clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Samuel sank onto the narrow cot and buried his face in his hands. Outside, he could hear Dustfire's hooves on the packed dirt, pacing back and forth in the alley beside the building. The mustang had taken up his vigil, and Samuel knew with bone-deep certainty that Dustfire wouldn't abandon his post. Not while his partner faced the gallows, not while the truth remained buried like a secret in the desert sand. But sometimes, loyalty wasn't enough to save a man's life. Sometimes, the truth stayed buried forever. As the shadows lengthened toward evening, Samuel Creek began to understand that he might die for a crime he didn't commit. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Martha Caldwell hadn't slept properly in 2 days. She stood behind the bar of the Dusty Rose Saloon, mechanically polishing glasses, while her mind turned over the details of Blackwood's murder like stones in a tumbler. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. Not just wrong, but carefully orchestrated wrong. She'd known Samuel Creek for 8 years, had played chess with him every Sunday after church, had listened to him read poetry aloud on quiet evenings, had watched him gentle wild horses and comfort frightened children with equal patience. The man who carved wooden toys for the orphans at Christmas wasn't capable of shooting someone in the back. But the evidence was damning, and Deadman's Bluff had made up its mind with the swift certainty of desert justice. Through the saloon's front window, she could see Dustfire in the alley beside the jail. The mustang hadn't moved more than a few yards from that spot since Samuel's arrest. Folks had tried to feed him, water him, lead him away. He'd accept the food and drink, but wouldn't budge from his self-appointed guard duty. Martha had seen loyal horses before, but this was different. This was almost human in its devotion and determination. "Another whiskey, Martha," called out Jim Patterson from his table near the back. The banker was one of several men who'd been drinking steadily since news of Samuel's arrest spread through town. "This whole business has me rattled." Martha poured the drink and carried it over, studying Patterson's face. "You don't seem like a man celebrating justice served." Patterson knocked back half the whiskey and shuddered. "Justice? Hell, Martha. I've known Samuel as long as anybody. Man's never been late on a payment, never shorted a debt, never caused a lick of trouble. Now they're saying he's a cold-blooded killer?" "But you saw the evidence," Martha said carefully. "His gun, the witness testimony. Evidence can lie," Patterson interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper, "especially when somebody wants it to lie." Before Martha could ask what he meant, the saloon doors swung open and Judge Harlan Pierce strode in, his black coat dusty from the road. Pierce commanded respect in Deadman's Bluff. He was educated, well-traveled, and had brought a sense of proper legal procedure to a town that had previously settled disputes with fists and firearms. But tonight, something about the judge's bearing troubled Martha. There was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of a man under pressure. "Evening, Judge," she called out. "What can I get you?" "Bourbon, the good stuff." Pierce settled at the bar, removing his black hat and running fingers through his silver hair. "Tomorrow's going to be a difficult day for all of us." Martha poured the bourbon and set it before him. "You've set the trial already?" "Trial?" Pierce laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Martha." The man was caught red-handed, his gun beside the body, his footprints at the scene, a witness who heard him threaten Blackwood. "What more evidence do you need?" "Evidence of motive, maybe?" Martha suggested. "Samuel and Blackwood had words, sure, but so did half the town. Why would Samuel risk everything he's built over a disagreement about store prices?" Pierce's hand tightened around his glass. "Sometimes men do foolish things when their temper gets the better of them. Samuel's never been a man to let temper rule him." Martha leaned against the bar, studying the judge's face. "In 8 years, have you ever seen him lose his composure, even when the Morrison brothers tried to cheat him out of that water rights deal?" "People change, Martha. Sometimes we discover we never really knew someone at all." The words carried an odd weight, as if Pierce was speaking about more than just Samuel Creek. Martha started to respond, but movement outside the window caught her attention. Dustfire had raised his head and was staring directly at the saloon. his ears pricked forward with alert attention, as if he were listening to their conversation. "That horse gives me the shivers," Pierce muttered, following her gaze. "Unnatural, the way he's acting." "Loyal," Martha corrected. "The way a partner should act." Pierce finished his bourbon and stood abruptly. "Loyalty doesn't change facts, Martha. Samuel Creek will hang tomorrow afternoon, and we'll all be safer for it." After the judge left, Martha found herself alone with her thoughts and the soft sounds of Dustfire moving restlessly in the alley. She pulled out the bundle of letters she'd been sorting through, earlier correspondence from various suppliers and customers that had accumulated in the weeks before Blackwood's death. Most of it was routine business, but one letter made her pause. It was from a law firm in Denver, addressed to Theodore Blackwood, regarding outstanding obligations and the necessity of immediate resolution. The language was formal, but the underlying threat was clear: pay up or face consequences. Martha had found the letter in Blackwood's coat pocket when Doc Henderson asked her to help prepare the body for burial. She'd meant to give it to Sheriff Morrison, but something had held her back. Now she spread it on the bar and read it again by lamplight. Blackwood owed money, serious money, to serious people, the kind of debt that men killed over or died over. But if Blackwood was in financial trouble, why had he been buying expensive inventory and expanding his store? Martha had seen the shipments arriving from Denver and San Francisco: silk dresses, fine jewelry, imported liquors. Not the purchases of a man worried about debt collectors, unless he'd been spending someone else's money. Martha folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron. Outside, Dustfire whinnied softly, the sound carrying clearly through the evening air. She moved to the window and looked out at the mustang, who seemed to be watching her with an intelligence that was almost human. "What do you know, boy?" she whispered. "What did you see that we're all missing?" As if in response, Dustfire took a few steps toward the saloon, then stopped and looked back toward the hills beyond town. The same hills he'd been staring at since Samuel's arrest. The same direction he'd focused on after examining Blackwood's body. Martha made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Tomorrow, while the town prepared for Samuel's execution, she was going to follow that horse's lead. She was going to find out what Dustfire knew that the rest of them didn't. Because if Samuel Creek was innocent and every instinct Martha possessed told her he was, then the real killer was still out there, still free, still dangerous. And justice in Deadman's Bluff was about to claim the wrong man. The courthouse of Deadman's Bluff had seen many things in its 10 years of existence, but never a trial that moved with such ruthless efficiency. Judge Pierce gavelled the proceedings to order at precisely 9 o'clock, his manner brisk and businesslike, as if he were conducting a routine land dispute rather than a capital murder case. Samuel sat in the defendant's chair, hands folded in his lap, watching the farce unfold with growing disbelief. He'd asked for a proper attorney, but the nearest lawyer was 3 days' ride away in Silver Creek, and Pierce had declared that justice delayed was justice denied. Samuel would defend himself or accept the court-appointed counsel of whoever happened to be available. That turned out to be Marcus Webb, the town's stuttering clerk, whose legal experience consisted of copying documents and filing papers. "The prosecution will present its evidence," Webb whispered nervously, shuffling through a stack of papers with trembling hands. "Then we get our chance to respond." Sheriff Morrison took the stand first, laying out the physical evidence with methodical precision. Samuel's gun, found at the scene. The witness testimony from Mrs. Henderson, who claimed to have seen Samuel arguing with Blackwood the previous day. The lack of any alibi for the time of the murder. "And where exactly was Mr. Creek when you arrested him?" the prosecutor asked. Morrison's deputy, Collins, had been designated to handle the prosecution, another irregularity that might have raised eyebrows in a more civilized court. "Standing over the body when I arrived," Morrison answered reluctantly. "But Sheriff—" Webb started to object, his stutter forgotten in his excitement. "Doesn't it seem strange that—" "The defendant will have his opportunity to present alternative theories," Judge Pierce interrupted sharply. "Proceed with your examination." Deputy Collins. Outside the courthouse, Martha Caldwell sat on the steps, supposedly waiting for the trial to conclude, but actually studying Dustfire's behavior. The Mustang had positioned himself across the street, where he could see both the courthouse and the jail. His attention kept shifting between the two buildings, as if he were monitoring some invisible threat. When Mrs. Henderson took the stand to describe the argument she'd witnessed between Samuel and Blackwood, Dustfire's ears flicked forward with sharp attention. The old woman's testimony was damning. She claimed Samuel had threatened to make Blackwood pay for bleeding the town dry. But Martha noticed something the court seemed to miss. Mrs. Henderson kept glancing toward Judge Pierce as she spoke, as if seeking approval or confirmation, and Pierce nodded almost imperceptibly each time she made a particularly damaging statement. Mr. Creek was very angry. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice gaining strength, said there would be consequences if Mr. Blackwood didn't change his ways, said some folks might take matters into their own hands. Martha frowned. She'd known Mrs. Henderson for 15 years, and the woman had never been one to embellish or exaggerate. But today, her testimony sounded almost rehearsed, as if she'd been coached on exactly what to say. Inside the courthouse, Samuel's makeshift defense was crumbling before it began. Marcus Webb called only 2 witnesses. Doc Henderson, who could only confirm that Blackwood had died from a single gunshot wound, and Jim Patterson, who testified to Samuel's good character but admitted under cross-examination that even good men can break under pressure. "Your Honor," Webb said during his closing argument, "my client has been a model citizen for 8 years. He's helped his neighbors, paid his debts, never caused trouble. Surely that counts for something. Character references don't erase physical evidence." Deputy Collins countered smoothly. The defendant's gun killed Theodore Blackwood. The defendant was found standing over the body. The defendant had publicly threatened the victim. What more proof does this court need? Judge Pierce deliberated for exactly 7 minutes before returning with his verdict. In the case of the Territory versus Samuel Creek, this court finds the defendant guilty of murder in the 1st degree. The gavel fell with the finality of thunder. Samuel felt the world tilt beneath him. Guilty. He was going to hang for a crime he didn't commit, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. "Sentencing will take place immediately," Pierce continued. "Samuel Creek, you have been found guilty of the cold-blooded murder of Theodore Blackwood. This court sentences you to death by hanging, sentence to be carried out tomorrow at noon." A murmur ran through the packed courtroom. Even by frontier standards, the speed of the proceedings was breathtaking. Most capital cases took days, sometimes weeks. Samuel's trial had lasted less than 3 hours. As the sheriff led him back to his cell, Samuel caught sight of Martha through the courthouse window. She was standing beside Dustfire now, her hand resting on the Mustang's neck, both of them watching the courthouse with expressions of shared concern. "Martha believes me," Samuel thought. "At least one person in this town knows I'm innocent." But belief wouldn't save him from the noose. That night, alone in his cell, Samuel listened to Dustfire pacing in the alley. The Mustang's hoofbeats had taken on a different rhythm, more urgent, more purposeful, as if time were running out and desperate measures were required. Samuel pulled out his father's silver dollar and held it up to catch the moonlight filtering through the barred window. "I'm sorry, Pa," he whispered to the empty air. "I tried to build something worthwhile, tried to be the man you wanted me to be." The dollar slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor, coming to rest against the far wall. As Samuel bent to retrieve it, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of his cell door's lock clicking open. Sheriff Morrison stood in the doorway, his face grave in the lamplight. "Samuel, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Samuel straightened slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Sheriff, there are things about this case that don't add up," Morrison said quietly. "Things I should have questioned before the trial. But it's too late now. The sentence has been passed, and I'm sworn to carry it out." "Then why are you here?" Morrison glanced over his shoulder, then stepped into the cell and closed the door behind him. Because I've been thinking about your horse, about how he's been acting since the arrest. Outside, as if summoned by their conversation, Dustfire whinnied a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry all the grief in the world. Animals know things we don't, Morrison continued. My grandfather was Apache, and he always said that horses could see into a man's spirit, could tell the difference between a killer and an innocent man. Samuel felt a flicker of hope. Sheriff, if you think I'm innocent, what I think doesn't matter anymore, Morrison cut him off. But what that horse thinks, that might matter more than any of us realize. The sheriff turned to leave, then paused at the door. Samuel, if I were you, I'd spend tonight making peace with whatever needs making peace with. Tomorrow's going to come whether we're ready or not. After Morrison left, Samuel moved to the window and looked out at Dustfire. The mustang was standing perfectly still now, his head raised toward the moon, as if listening to some distant sound that human ears couldn't detect. You hear something, boy? Samuel whispered. Or are you planning something? Dustfire turned toward the jail window, and for a moment their eyes met across the darkness. In the mustang's gaze, Samuel saw something that made his heart skip, not just loyalty or grief, but determination. Dustfire wasn't just maintaining a vigil, he was preparing for war. Martha spent the long hours before dawn searching through every piece of paper in Theodore Blackwood's store. Using the key she'd borrowed from Doc Henderson, who'd been tasked with settling the dead man's affairs, she worked by lamplight, sifting through invoices, correspondence, and ledgers with growing alarm. The financial picture that emerged was far more complex than anyone in Deadman's Bluff had realized. Blackwood wasn't just a successful merchant, he was a man with dangerous secrets and powerful enemies. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard behind the counter, Martha discovered a leather-bound ledger that made her hands tremble as she read. Page after page, detailed payments made to various townspeople, not for goods or services, but for silence. Sheriff Morrison, $500 for overlooking certain irregularities in shipping manifests. Judge Pierce, $800 for favorable rulings in commercial disputes. Even Dr. Henderson, $300 for discretion regarding certain medical examinations. Blackwood had been blackmailing half the town's leadership. But the most shocking entry was the most recent one, dated just 2 days before his murder. J.M. Final payment demanded. Will not negotiate further. Time for permanent solution. J.M. could be anyone, James Morrison, Janet Miller, John Murphy. But as Martha studied the handwriting more carefully, she noticed something that made her pulse race. In the margin beside that entry, someone had written a note in different ink, creek problem resolved simultaneously. Samuel wasn't just a convenient scapegoat, he was a deliberate target. Martha closed the ledger and tucked it inside her coat, her mind racing. She needed to get this evidence to someone who could act on it, but who could she trust? If Blackwood had been blackmailing the sheriff and the judge, then the entire legal system of Deadman's Bluff was compromised. Outside, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. In just 6 hours, Samuel Creek would climb the gallows steps unless she could find a way to stop it. As she prepared to leave the store, Martha heard the sound she'd been dreading, the rhythmic hammering of nails being driven into wood. Through the front window, she could see men working on the gallows in the pre-dawn light, testing the platform, adjusting the rope, making sure everything would function properly for the noon execution. The sight filled her with cold rage. These men were preparing to murder an innocent person, and they were taking care to do it efficiently. Martha slipped out the back door of the store and made her way toward the jail, keeping to the shadows. She needed to see Dustfire, needed to understand what the mustang might know that could help Samuel. She found the horse exactly where she expected, standing in the alley beside the jail, but his posture was different now. Instead of the patient vigil he'd maintained for days, Dustfire was alert and agitated, ears constantly swiveling, nostrils flared, as if scenting danger on the wind. "Easy, boy," Martha whispered, approaching slowly. "What's got you so worked up?" Dustfire allowed her to come close, but his attention remained fixed on something beyond her. Following his gaze, Martha saw two men on horseback at the far end of the alley, strangers, by their look, wearing trail dust and the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence. One of them noticed her watching and nudged his companion. They turned their horses and rode away, but not before Martha caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. The taller man wore a distinctive silver belt buckle that she'd seen before in Blackwood's store, when he'd been negotiating with someone about a special delivery that needed to arrive without official notice. These weren't just strangers passing through town. They were part of whatever web of corruption had gotten Blackwood killed and Samuel framed. Martha pressed herself against the jail wall as the reality of the situation hit her. Samuel wasn't going to get a last-minute reprieve or a miraculous revelation of his innocence. The people who controlled Deadman's Bluff wanted him dead, and they'd orchestrated events to make sure it happened. But Dustfire had other plans. The mustang suddenly lifted his head and released a piercing whinny that echoed off the adobe walls, not a cry of distress, but a call to action. Before Martha could react, the horse turned and trotted purposefully toward the main street, pausing only to look back at her with an expression that clearly said, "Follow me." Martha hesitated for a moment, then made a decision that surprised even her. She followed the horse. Dustfire led her through the sleeping town with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. They passed the church, the general store, the blacksmith shop, moving steadily toward the outskirts of Deadman's Bluff, where the desert began to reclaim the land. Just beyond the last row of houses, Dustfire stopped beside a cluster of large rocks that formed a natural shelter. The mustang pawed at the ground insistently, then stepped back and fixed Martha with that unnervingly intelligent stare. "What is it, boy? What do you want me to see?" Martha knelt and began brushing away the loose sand and gravel. Her fingers encountered something hard and metallic, another gun, this one unfamiliar, with carved wooden grips that didn't match Samuel's simple, practical weapon. But more importantly, the gun was still warm, recently fired. As Martha lifted the weapon, she heard the soft sound of footsteps on sand behind her. She turned to see Judge Pierce standing 20 yards away, his black coat making him nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. "You should have minded your own business, Martha," Pierce said sadly. "Theodore warned me you were too curious for your own good. You killed him. It wasn't a question." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Blackwood was blackmailing you, and when he got too greedy, you decided to eliminate the problem. Theodore got careless, started making demands I couldn't meet, threats I couldn't ignore. Pierce stepped closer, and Martha could see the exhaustion in his face. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be trapped by your own mistakes? To wake up every morning knowing that one word from a man like Blackwood could destroy everything you've built?" Martha clutched the warm gun, her mind racing. "So you killed him and framed Samuel. 2 problems solved with 1 crime." Samuel was convenient, a loner with no family, no powerful friends, someone the town could sacrifice without causing too much trouble. Pierce's voice carried a note of genuine regret. "I never wanted it to come to this, Martha. But you've seen too much. Know too much." "The ledger," Martha said suddenly. "You need it back, don't you? That's why you're here, instead of preparing for the execution." Pierce nodded wearily. "Where is it, Martha? Make this easy on both of us." But Martha wasn't listening anymore. She was watching Dustfire, who had positioned himself between her and the judge. The mustang's ears were pinned back against his skull, his muscles coiled for action, every line of his body radiating protective fury. "You want to know what Theodore's mistake was?" Pierce continued, apparently oblivious to the danger building in the horse behind him. He thought he could control everyone and everything. Never occurred to him that sometimes the prey fights back. Dustfire exploded into motion. The mustang launched himself at Judge Pierce with the fury of 8 years of loyalty to Samuel Creek. Pierce tried to dodge, but 1,200 pounds of enraged horse doesn't give a man many options. Dustfire's shoulder caught the judge in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into the rocks. Martha didn't wait to see the outcome. She ran toward town, clutching the evidence that would save Samuel's life, while behind her the sounds of Pierce's panicked cries mixed with Dustfire's triumphant neighing. The mustang had known all along, had led her to the proof they needed, had protected her when the truth became dangerous. Samuel was right. Dustfire wasn't just a horse. He was a partner who would fight for justice when humans failed to deliver it. But as Martha reached the outskirts of town, she realized their problems were far from over. The sun was rising, and in just a few hours, Samuel Creek would climb the gallows steps. She had the evidence to prove his innocence, but she still had to convince a town that had already made up its mind about guilt and punishment. And somewhere behind her in the desert, Judge Pierce was either dead or planning his own desperate measures to keep his secrets buried. The sun climbed relentlessly toward its noon appointment with Samuel Creek's neck. By 10 o'clock, the gallows stood ready in the center of Deadman's Bluff's main street, its fresh lumber gleaming like bone in the desert light. Someone had even swept the platform clean and tested the trapdoor mechanism twice to ensure it would function smoothly. Samuel sat in his cell, wearing the clean shirt and pressed trousers that Sheriff Morrison had brought him for his final hour. It was a kindness. He supposed dying with dignity mattered, even when justice had failed so completely. Outside his window, Dustfire was nowhere to be seen. The mustang's absence worried Samuel more than his own, approaching death. For 3 days, that horse had maintained his loyal vigil. Now, when the end was so close, Dustfire had vanished. "Maybe it's better this way," Samuel murmured to himself. "No point in you watching them murder me, boy." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel felt their falseness. Dustfire wasn't the type to abandon his partner, especially not now. Which meant the mustang was up to something that might be more dangerous than helpful. The sound of boots on wooden planks drew Samuel's attention to the window. A crowd was gathering around the gallows, early arrivals claiming the best viewing positions for the noon spectacle. Some faces showed the grim satisfaction of citizens seeing justice served. Others displayed the morbid curiosity that drew people to witness death. But one face in the crowd made Samuel's heart sink even further. Martha Caldwell stood near the gallows, her expression anguished, clutching something against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. She'd tried to help him, Samuel realized, tried and failed, and now she had to watch him die knowing the truth. "Samuel." Sheriff Morrison's voice was quiet, respectful. "It's time." The walk to the gallows felt both endless and instantaneous. Samuel's legs moved without conscious direction, carrying him through the crowd that parted before him like water. He was dimly aware of voices, some shouting for justice, others murmuring prayers, but the words seemed to come from a great distance. The 13 steps felt solid beneath his feet, 13 steps that hundreds of condemned men had climbed before him, leading to the small platform where frontier justice reached its final conclusion. "Samuel Creek," Judge Pierce announced to the assembled crowd, "you have been found guilty of the murder of Theodore Blackwood and sentenced to death by hanging. Do you have any final words?" Samuel looked out over the crowd, searching for friendly faces among the sea of strangers and neighbors. Martha was there, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jim Patterson from the bank, his face grim with resignation. Doc Henderson, who delivered Samuel into this world and now watched him prepare to leave it. "I'm innocent," Samuel said simply. "I never killed Theodore Blackwood. I never killed anyone, and I'm sorry that this town has chosen vengeance over truth." Judge Pierce nodded to the executioner, a hooded man who stepped forward with the noose. The rope was coarse against Samuel's throat, smelling of hemp and death. "Any moment now," Samuel thought. "Any moment, and it'll all be over." That's when Martha Caldwell's voice cut through the morning air like a rifle shot. "Stop! This man is innocent!" The crowd turned toward her in surprise, murmuring uncertainly. Judge Pierce frowned, his hand raised to signal the executioner. The condemned man has had his trial, Miss Caldwell. Justice must proceed. But Martha pushed through the crowd, holding up a leather-bound book that Samuel recognized as one of Blackwood's ledgers. Judge Pierce, this ledger contains evidence that proves Samuel's innocence and identifies the real killer. Pierce's face went pale. Miss Caldwell, you're disrupting a legal execution. Sheriff Morrison, remove this woman immediately. But Morrison made no move to comply. Instead, he studied Martha's face with the careful attention of a lawman who'd learned to read truth in people's expressions. What kind of evidence? Martha. Theodore Blackwood was blackmailing half this town, Martha announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, including members of our own government. This ledger contains records of payments made for silence, favors bought and sold, corruption that goes right to the top of Deadman's Bluff's leadership. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Pierce stepped forward, his voice carrying all the authority of his office. This is nothing but desperate lies from a woman who refuses to accept justice. Then explain this. Martha held up the unfamiliar gun she'd found in the desert. This weapon was used to kill Theodore Blackwood. It was hidden in the rocks beyond town, still warm from recent firing. And it belongs to Judge Harlan Pierce. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some people shouted in disbelief, others demanded to see the evidence, still others called for the execution to proceed as planned. Above the din, Judge Pierce's voice rose in furious denial. Lies. All of it lies. Samuel Creek is a murderer, and he will hang for his crimes. Pierce signaled desperately to the executioner, who reached for the trapdoor lever. But before his hand could complete the motion, a sound froze, every person in the square, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at full gallop. Dustfire burst into the square like an avenging spirit, his coat gleaming with sweat, his eyes wild with determination. But he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him on a makeshift rope were two men, their hands bound, their faces bloodied and defiant. The mustang charged straight for the gallows, scattering the crowd like tumbleweeds. At the last second, he slid to a stop and reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air inches from the platform where Samuel stood with the noose around his neck. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Morrison breathed. "That horse just brought us some prisoners." The two men Dustfire had captured were the same strangers Martha had seen in the alley, the ones with the silver belt buckles and the hard faces of professional killers. And judging by their condition, they'd had a very unpleasant morning, explaining their business in Deadman's Bluff to one extremely angry mustang. Samuel felt the rope around his neck loosen as Morrison climbed onto the platform. The sheriff's expression was grim but determined as he faced the confused, angry crowd. "Folks, I think we need to take a step back and consider some new evidence before we proceed with this execution." Judge Pierce's voice cracked with desperation. "Sheriff, you can't let this circus continue. The law demands truth," Morrison cut him off, "and it looks like we might not have gotten the whole truth the first time around." As the crowd argued and shouted, Samuel looked down at Dustfire, who stood calmly beside the gallows, as if capturing criminals and stopping executions was just another day's work for an exceptionally intelligent horse. "Good boy," Samuel whispered. "I knew you hadn't abandoned me." Dustfire whinnied softly in response, and Samuel could swear he saw something that looked like a smile in those dark, knowing eyes. The leather bridle that had restrained Dustfire for 3 days lay broken in the dust beside the gallows, its straps snapped by the mustang's desperate escape. Samuel stared down at the torn leather, understanding with crystalline clarity that this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. Dustfire hadn't just broken free, he'd been preparing for this confrontation since the moment they'd arrested his partner. Sheriff Morrison pulled the noose from Samuel's neck and helped him down from the platform, while Deputy Collins secured the two prisoners Dustfire had dragged into town. The men were battered and exhausted, their expensive clothes torn, their arrogant expressions replaced by the haunted look of people who'd encountered something beyond their understanding. "Names," Morrison demanded, standing over them with his rifle ready. The taller man, his silver belt buckle now dented and tarnished, spat blood into the dust. "Jake Morrison, and this here's Charlie Vance. We got business in this town, Sheriff." "What kind of business involves trying to murder an innocent man?" Jake Morrison, no relation to the sheriff despite the shared name, laughed bitterly. "Innocent? That horse of his is a devil. Tracked us for 20 miles. Cornered us in a box canyon, and wouldn't let us leave until we agreed to come back and tell the truth." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Charlie Vance, the smaller man, looked around at the assembled faces with desperate eyes. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. That animal, it ain't natural. It knew things, knew where we'd been, what we'd done." Martha pushed forward, still clutching Blackwood's ledger. "Tell them about Theodore Blackwood. Tell them who really killed him, and why." Jake Morrison's face hardened. "We didn't kill nobody. We were hired to clean up after the killing got done, make sure the right man took the blame for it." Judge Pierce, who had been growing paler by the moment, suddenly pushed through the crowd toward the edge of the square. "This is all nonsense, desperate lies from desperate men." But Dustfire was already moving. The mustang intercepted Pierce's escape route, herding the judge back toward the center of the square with the practiced skill of a horse who'd spent years working cattle. Every time Pierce tried to dodge left or right, Dustfire was there, blocking his path, forcing him back toward the gallows and the truth. "Tell them, Judge," Martha called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "Tell them how Theodore Blackwood was bleeding you dry with his blackmail scheme. Tell them how you finally decided to end it permanently." Pierce stopped struggling against Dustfire's herding and turned to face the crowd, his dignity cracking like dried mud. "You want the truth? Fine. Yes, I killed Theodore Blackwood, but not for the reasons you think." A gasp ran through the assembled townspeople. Samuel felt his knees go weak with relief and rage. 3 days on death row for another man's crime. And now the truth was finally emerging. "Theodore wasn't just blackmailing me," Pierce continued, his voice gaining strength. "He was destroying this entire town, corrupting everyone who had any power or influence. He had to be stopped. So you shot him in the back?" Sheriff Morrison's voice was deadly quiet. "I confronted him behind his store, told him the blackmail had to end. He laughed at me, said he owned me, owned all of us." Pierce's hands shook as he spoke. "Said he'd already arranged for Samuel Creek to take the blame when the time came. Had it all planned out, the planted gun, the witness testimony, even these 2 killers to make sure no loose ends remained untied." Jake Morrison spat again. "Judge hired us to make sure Creek never made it to trial, was supposed to look like he tried to escape and got shot for his trouble. But that horse," Charlie Vance added, his voice filled with superstitious fear, "soon as we got close to the jail, it started hunting us, like it could smell our intentions." Martha stepped forward, opening Blackwood's ledger to a specific page. "Judge Pierce, according to this record, you owed Theodore Blackwood $8,000 in gambling debts, money you'd borrowed from the county treasury to cover your losses." Pierce laughed bitterly. $8,000 was just the beginning. Theodore had documents proving I'd been skimming money from court fees for 2 years. He owned me completely until I decided I'd rather be a murderer than a slave. Samuel found his voice at last. "And I was just convenient? Someone to pin your crime on?" "Theodore's idea, actually," Pierce admitted. "He'd been planning to frame you for months, ever since you started asking questions about his business practices. Said it would solve 2 problems at once, eliminate a troublesome citizen and provide a scapegoat for when he finally pushed someone too far." The crowd was growing angry now, their shock giving way to outrage. Jim Patterson from the bank stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Judge, we trusted you. We believed in your integrity." "My integrity?" Pierce laughed harshly. "Where was your integrity when Theodore was charging widows 3 times the fair price for flour, when he was demanding kickbacks from every merchant who wanted to do business in this town?" "That didn't give you the right to murder him," Martha shot back. or to let an innocent man hang for your crime?" Dustfire, who had been standing quietly during the confessions, suddenly approached Judge Pierce. The mustang's eyes were calm but unforgiving as he studied the man who had nearly destroyed his partner. Then, with deliberate precision, Dustfire stepped on Pierce's foot and refused to move. Pierce yelped in pain and tried to push the horse away, but Dustfire simply increased the pressure until the judge was gasping in agony. It was frontier justice at its most elemental, not a legal punishment, but the simple consequence of betraying trust and trying to murder an innocent man. Sheriff Morrison allowed it to continue for a long moment before finally whistling softly. Dustfire immediately stepped back, but his message was clear. Some debts could only be paid in pain and humiliation. "Harlan Pierce," Morrison announced formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Theodore Blackwood and conspiracy to commit the judicial murder of Samuel Creek." As the deputy led Pierce away in shackles, the judge turned back toward Samuel one last time. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I never wanted it to come to this." Samuel met his eyes steadily. "Judge, the sorry part isn't that you killed Blackwood. The sorry part is that you were willing to let me die for it." The crowd began to disperse, their bloodlust satisfied, but their faith in frontier justice badly shaken. Samuel stood beside the gallows, still wearing the clean shirt they'd given him for his execution, watching his neighbors file away with expressions of shame and confusion. Martha approached him carefully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Samuel, I'm so sorry we didn't figure it out sooner." "Martha, you figured it out in time. That's what matters." Samuel reached out and touched Dustfire's neck, feeling the solid warmth of the horse who'd saved his life. "We both did." But as he spoke the words, Samuel realized that the morning's revelations had answered some questions while raising others. Dustfire had demonstrated an intelligence and determination that went far beyond normal animal behavior. The Mustang had tracked killers, gathered evidence, and orchestrated a rescue with the strategic thinking of a human partner, which raised a troubling question. Exactly what kind of horse had Samuel Creek been living with for the past 8 years? Samuel's father's pocket watch lay half buried in the sand where Dustfire had led them, its silver surface reflecting the afternoon sun like a beacon of vindication. Martha knelt beside the timepiece, brushing away the grit and debris that had accumulated around it during the 3 days since Theodore Blackwood's murder. "This is it," she breathed, turning the watch over to reveal the inscription Samuel knew by heart. "To Samuel Creek time and truth prevail, your loving father, 1847. Samuel accepted the watch with hands that trembled slightly. He'd discovered it missing from his vest pocket the morning of his arrest, had assumed it had fallen somewhere during the chaos of finding Blackwood's body. Now he understood the truth. The watch had been deliberately taken and planted as evidence of his presence at the scene. Theodore had this in his hand when he died, Samuel realized. Grabbed it during the struggle with Pierce, trying to identify his killer. Sheriff Morrison examined the watch carefully, noting the traces of blood on the chain and the scratches on the case that suggested a violent struggle. "This proves you were telling the truth about your whereabouts that morning, Samuel. You couldn't have lost this watch at the murder scene if you were 20 miles away tending to a sick calf." But even as relief flooded through him, Samuel felt a deeper unease settling in his chest. Dustfire stood nearby, watching the humans examine their evidence with an expression of patient satisfaction. The Mustang had led them directly to this spot, as if he'd known exactly where to look for the one piece of proof that would conclusively establish Samuel's innocence. "How did you know, boy?" Samuel murmured, approaching his horse with new wariness. "How did you know where to find it?" Dustfire whinnied softly and nudged Samuel's shoulder, the same gentle gesture of affection he'd offered thousands of times before. But now Samuel found himself studying the Mustang with different eyes, seeing intelligence and calculation where he'd previously seen only loyalty and instinct. Martha noticed his expression and moved closer. "Samuel, What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Samuel continued, staring at Dustfire, his mind racing through 8 years of memories with new understanding. "Martha, think about everything that's happened since my arrest, everything Dustfire has done. He's been trying to help you, trying to prove your innocence. But how? How did he know where to find evidence? How did he track down Pierce's hired killers? How did he know exactly when to intervene at the gallows?" Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "Horses don't think strategically, Martha. They don't plan rescues, or gather evidence, or coordinate multiple actions to achieve a specific goal." Sheriff Morrison approached them, his expression thoughtful. "Samuel, I've been thinking about what those killers said, about Dustfire, tracking them for 20 miles, cornering them, forcing them to return to town and confess. That's what they claimed. But I found their camp this morning, saw the tracks, the signs of struggle." Morrison's weathered face was grave. "Samuel, that horse didn't just track them. He outsmarted them. Set traps, used terrain to his advantage, even seemed to anticipate their attempts to escape." A chill ran down Samuel's spine. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Martha asked quietly. "Samuel, think about all the times Dustfire has done things that seemed almost human. The way he reads weather patterns, finds water, senses danger. The way he seems to understand human conversation and respond accordingly." Samuel's memories shifted like sand in the wind, 8 years of partnership taking on new and disturbing significance. Dustfire, finding the hidden gold claim that had helped establish Samuel's ranch. Dustfire leading him away from the Apache war party that would have killed them both. Dustfire somehow knowing which trails were safe during the flash flood season. "He's saved my life a dozen times," Samuel admitted. "Made decisions that seemed to show reasoning and planning, but I always told myself it was just exceptional animal instinct." "What if it wasn't?" Martha pressed. "What if Dustfire is something more than just an exceptional horse?" The question hung in the desert air, like smoke from a distant fire. Samuel found himself remembering the night he'd first encountered Dustfire, not as a yearling colt, as he'd always told the story, but as something wild and otherworldly moving through the moonlight. He'd been drunk that night, celebrating a successful cattle drive, and his memories were hazy. But now, forcing himself to recall the details, he remembered eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom and a bearing that suggested nobility beyond any earthly bloodline. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. "Samuel, there's something else you should know, something I discovered when I was investigating Blackwood's murder." "What is it, Sheriff?" "Theodore kept detailed records of everyone in town, their debts, their secrets, their weaknesses. He had files on most of the prominent citizens." Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "But the thickest file was about you and Dustfire." Samuel felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of information?" "Newspaper clippings from towns you'd passed through over the years. Stories about a mysterious cowboy and his impossible horse who always seemed to appear when justice needed serving. A range war in Colorado where you and Dustfire exposed cattle rustlers, a mining dispute in Nevada where you uncovered claim jumpers, a dozen incidents where you arrived at just the right time to set things right." Martha's eyes widened. "How many towns, Samuel?" "I don't know what you're talking about." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel knew they weren't true. He did remember those incidents had told himself they were coincidences, lucky timing, the natural result of being in the right place at the right time. But now he wondered if there had been a pattern, a purpose, a destiny that he'd been too blind or too stubborn to recognize. "Theodore was obsessed with you both," Morrison continued. "Thought you might be some kind of frontier vigilantes, traveling from town to fight corruption and injustice. He was convinced Dustfire wasn't a normal horse." "That's ridiculous," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dustfire approached him then, moving with the fluid grace that Samuel had always admired, but never questioned. The mustang's dark eyes met his, and for a moment, Samuel felt as if he were looking into depths that no earthly creature should possess. "Who are you?" he whispered. "What are you?" Instead of answering, which would have been impossible for a normal horse, Dustfire did something that made Samuel's blood freeze. The mustang nodded. Once, deliberately, unmistakably, as if he understood not just the words, but the profound implications behind them. Martha gasped. Sheriff Morrison took an involuntary step backward, and Samuel Creek, who thought he'd known his partner for 8 years, realized he might not have known him at all. "We need to get back to town," Morrison said suddenly, his lawman's instincts alert to danger. "Those killers Pierce hired might have friends, and if word spreads about what happened here today, about what Dustfire can do—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. A horse with human-like intelligence would attract attention from people who might want to exploit or study or destroy such a creature. Dustfire had revealed his true nature to save Samuel's life, but that revelation might have put them both in even greater danger. "Mount up," Samuel said quietly. "We're going home." But as they prepared to leave the desert where the truth had finally been revealed, Samuel wondered if home would ever feel the same again. He'd gained his freedom and cleared his name, but he'd lost something precious in the process, the comfortable illusion that he understood the world and his place in it. Now, riding beside a creature who might not be what he appeared to be, Samuel Creek faced the most unsettling question of his life: exactly who had been the real partner in their 8-year relationship. The sheriff's badge caught the late afternoon sun as Wade Morrison faced the hardest decision of his 15-year career in law enforcement. He stood in the center of Deadman's Bluff's main street, watching armed men take positions on rooftops and behind storefronts, their rifles glinting in the golden light. The town had divided into factions overnight, those who believed in Samuel Creek's innocence and those who demanded someone pay for Theodore Blackwood's murder, regardless of the truth. "Sheriff, you need to choose a side," called out Frank Coleman from behind the water trough near the general store. Coleman had ridden in from his ranch with 6 of his hands, all armed and determined to see what they called real justice served. "Either that horse is some kind of devil creature that needs killing, or you've been harboring a murderer for 8 years. Morrison spat into the dust, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Frank, the only choice I'm making is to uphold the law." Judge Pierce confessed to Blackwood's murder. Samuel Creek is innocent. Case closed. Pierce was coerced, tortured by that unnatural animal. Coleman's voice carried the edge of hysteria that had been building in certain quarters since Dustfire's dramatic rescue at the gallows. No normal horse acts the way that creature acts. From the opposite side of the street, Martha Caldwell emerged from her saloon with her own contingent of supporters, townspeople who'd witnessed Dustfire's intelligence and loyalty and saw them as gifts rather than threats. Jim Patterson from the bank stood beside her, along with Doc Henderson and a dozen others who'd come to believe that something extraordinary had taken place in their small frontier town. "Sheriff Morrison is right," Martha announced firmly. "Samuel Creek is innocent, and Dustfire saved an innocent man's life. If that makes the horse special, then God bless him for it." Samuel himself stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, still wearing his execution clothes, watching his neighbors prepare for what looked like a small civil war. Beside him, Dustfire waited with supernatural calm, as if armed confrontations were just another aspect of frontier life to be endured with patience and dignity. "This is my fault," Samuel said quietly to the mustang. "I should have kept your abilities secret." Dustfire turned to look at him, and Samuel could swear he saw understanding and forgiveness in those dark eyes. Whatever the horse truly was, he bore no resentment for being exposed or endangered. "Samuel Creek," Frank Coleman shouted across the street, "you come out here and face what you've brought to our town." "Frank, what I've brought to your town is 8 years of honest work and good citizenship," Samuel replied, stepping into the street. "What you're bringing is fear and ignorance." "Ignorance?" Coleman laughed harshly. "Boy, I've been ranching in this country for 20 years. I know horses, and that thing ain't no horse. It's something else. Something wrong." Morrison stepped between the two factions, his badge catching the light like a signal flag. "Frank, you're welcome to your opinions about horses and devils and whatever else keeps you awake at night. But you're not welcome to disturb the peace of my town with armed threats." "Your town?" Coleman's men shifted restlessly, their weapons ready. "Wade, this stopped being just your town the minute that creature started displaying powers no earthly animal should possess." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with 30 armed men facing each other across the dusty street, while the sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Samuel could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and Deadman's Bluff would earn its name all over again. That's when Dustfire made his choice. The Mustang stepped away from Samuel and walked deliberately into the center of the street, positioning himself between the two armed factions. He stood perfectly still for a moment, his head raised, his bearing noble and unafraid. Then he began to move. What followed was unlike anything the people of Deadman's Bluff had ever witnessed. Dustfire performed a series of movements that were part dance, part demonstration, part communication, with a species too limited to understand his true language. He moved with fluid precision, showing his intelligence without threatening, displaying his abilities without boasting. The Mustang traced patterns in the dust with his hooves, complex geometric shapes that spoke of understanding far beyond animal instinct. He manipulated objects with his teeth and hooves, arranging stones and branches into formations that suggested planning and reasoning. Most remarkably, he seemed to respond to the unspoken thoughts and fears of the people watching him, addressing their concerns through gesture and movement. "My God," Doc Henderson breathed, "he's trying to communicate with us." Frank Coleman lowered his rifle slightly, his expression shifting from anger to awe. "What is he saying?" Samuel stepped forward, understanding flooding through him as he watched his partner's performance. "He's saying he's not our enemy. He's saying he's been protecting this town, protecting all of us, for years without asking for anything in return." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He's saying he just wants to be accepted for what he is." The demonstration continued for several more minutes, with Dustfire showing abilities that clearly transcended normal equine behavior while maintaining a demeanor of gentle dignity. He wasn't trying to dominate or frighten, he was trying to bridge the gap between species, to find common ground between horse and human. When he finally stopped, standing once again in the center of the street, a profound silence fell over Deadman's Bluff. 30 armed men stared at a horse who had just redefined their understanding of intelligence, loyalty, and the possible. Dustfire's hoofprint in the dried blood beside Theodore Blackwood's store told the final chapter of a story that had taken 3 days to unravel. Sheriff Morrison knelt beside the print, measuring its distinctive shape against the plaster cast he'd made that first morning. The match was perfect, but now it meant something entirely different than it had when Samuel Creek sat in a jail cell awaiting execution. "This print isn't evidence of guilt," Morrison announced to the crowd that had gathered around the original crime scene. "It's evidence of witness." Martha Caldwell stood beside him, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Dustfire saw the murder happen. He was here when Judge Pierce shot Theodore Blackwood in the back." Frank Coleman and his men had lowered their weapons after witnessing Dustfire's demonstration, but their faces still showed the strain of men grappling with concepts beyond their experience. "Sheriff," Coleman said slowly, "are you telling us that Horse witnessed a murder and then spent 3 days trying to solve it?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Frank." Morrison stood and brushed the dust from his knees, "and he did a better job of investigating than I did." Samuel approached the blood-stained ground where his life had nearly ended, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude and unease. Dustfire had saved him, but at the cost of revealing abilities that made him something more than animal, something less than human, something that didn't fit into the normal categories of frontier life. "The question now," Doc Henderson said thoughtfully, "is what we do with this knowledge." Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the edge of town. A group of riders was coming in fast, their dust cloud visible for miles across the desert. As they drew closer, Samuel could make out official badges and the hard faces of men accustomed to authority. "Federal marshals," Sheriff Morrison muttered. "Someone sent word to the territorial capital about what happened here." The lead rider was a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker side. He dismounted near the gallows, his gaze taking in the assembled crowd, the evidence of the morning's confrontation, and finally settling on Dustfire with particular interest. "I'm Marshal Robert Kane," he announced. "I'm here to investigate reports of unusual circumstances surrounding a murder trial in Deadman's Bluff." Judge Pierce, who had been sitting in the jail awaiting transport to the territorial prison, was brought out in shackles to face the federal authorities. His confession was recorded officially, his crimes documented with bureaucratic precision. But Marshal Kane's real interest became clear when he approached Dustfire, studying the mustang with the calculating gaze of a man who'd seen his share of unexplained phenomena on the frontier. "This is the animal that disrupted the execution?" Kane asked. "This is Dustfire," Samuel replied carefully. "My horse, my partner. Your partner who tracks killers, gathers evidence, and demonstrates problem-solving abilities that exceed those of most humans I know." Kane's voice was neutral, but his implication was clear. Samuel felt the familiar protective instinct rising in his chest. "Marshal, Dustfire is loyal and intelligent, but he's still just a horse." "Just a horse?" Kane smiled without humor. "Mr. Creek, I've spent 20 years investigating unusual incidents across the territories. Creatures that don't fit normal classifications, phenomena that can't be explained by conventional understanding. Your horse has attracted attention from people who study such things." Martha stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "Marshal, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that there are institutions back east, universities, government facilities, private collectors who would pay handsomely for the opportunity to study an animal with Dustfire's apparent capabilities." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. "You want to take him away?" "I want to understand what he is," Kane replied, "and I have the authority to claim custody of any creature or phenomenon that might pose a threat to public safety or national security." Frank Coleman, who had been listening with growing alarm, suddenly spoke up. "Marshal, that animal saved an innocent man's life, brought justice to our town when our own officials failed. How does that threaten public safety?" "Because," Kane said patiently, "if word spreads about a horse with human-level intelligence, it will attract attention from people far less benevolent than academic researchers. Trophy hunters, showmen, those who would exploit such a creature for profit or power." Samuel looked at Dustfire, seeing his own fear reflected in the mustang's calm but alert expression. After 8 years of partnership, they faced the possibility of forced separation, Samuel free to live his life. Dustfire condemned to existence as a curiosity in some distant laboratory. "Marshal," Samuel said quietly, "what if I told you that Dustfire's abilities only manifest in response to injustice? That he's not just intelligent, but morally motivated?" Kane raised an eyebrow. "I'd say that makes him even more valuable for study." "Then let me propose an alternative." Samuel's voice gained strength as a plan formed in his mind. "Instead of taking Dustfire away from everything he's known, why not let him continue doing what he's already been doing? Let him serve justice on the frontier under official supervision if necessary." "You're suggesting what, exactly?" "I'm suggesting that you deputize us both. Make our partnership official. Let Dustfire's abilities serve the law instead of being locked away in some eastern laboratory." Marshal Kane considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving between Samuel and Dustfire. The mustang stood perfectly still, as if understanding that his entire future hung on the marshal's decision. "An interesting proposition, Mr. Creek, a federal deputy and his unusually gifted mount." Kane's expression remained unreadable, But that would require me to believe that you can control and direct an animal with apparent supernatural abilities. Not control, Samuel corrected. Partner with. We've been doing it successfully for 8 years. Very well. Kane reached into his coat and withdrew a silver badge. Samuel Creek, I'm offering you a position as a federal deputy marshal with special jurisdiction over unusual crimes and phenomena in the territories. Your partner would be granted official recognition as a law enforcement asset. Samuel accepted the badge with trembling hands, feeling its weight like a promise and a burden combined. And if we refuse? Then I take custody of the animal for federal investigation, and you return to your ranch to live out your life as a private citizen. Kane's voice was matter-of-fact. The choice is yours, Mr. Creek. Samuel looked at Dustfire one more time, seeing in those dark eyes the same question that burned in his own heart. They could accept this new role and continue their partnership under official sanction, traveling from town to serve justice where it was needed most. Or they could be separated forever, leaving Samuel to wonder what might have been and Dustfire to face an uncertain fate in the hands of government researchers. Marshal, Samuel said finally, when do we start? A new headstone stood in the cemetery overlooking Deadman's Bluff, its marble surface gleaming white against the desert landscape. The inscription was simple but complete. Theodore Blackwood 1821, 1873, murdered by Judge Harlan Pierce, truth revealed through justice. Below that, in smaller letters, someone had added, some secrets die harder than the men who keep them. Samuel Creek sat on his horse, though he now knew that his horse was an inadequate description of their relationship, reading the headstone one final time before leaving Deadman's Bluff behind. The badge on his chest caught the morning sunlight, federal silver that marked him as something new in the territories. A deputy marshal whose jurisdiction extended to crimes that ordinary lawmen couldn't understand or solve. Dustfire stood patiently beneath him, saddled and ready for the trail, but Samuel sensed the mustang's eagerness to begin their new mission. They'd received word of strange happenings in Silver Creek. Cattle mysteriously returned after being rustled. A bank robbery foiled by what witnesses described as impossible luck, and rumors of a horse and rider who appeared whenever justice needed serving. Sounds like we've got competition, boy, Samuel murmured, patting Dustfire's neck. Or maybe we've got friends. Martha Caldwell approached them from the direction of her saloon, carrying a cloth bundle that smelled like fresh bread and coffee. Provisions for the trail, she explained, handing the bundle to Samuel, and a letter I want you to carry. Samuel accepted both, studying Martha's face. Letter? To my sister in Denver, telling her about everything that happened here. Martha smiled, but her eyes were serious. People need to know that there are things in this world beyond their understanding. Good things, things that fight for justice when humans fail to deliver it. Martha, that could bring the wrong kind of attention. Samuel, hiding the truth, never protected anyone for long. She looked up at him with the steady gaze of a woman who'd seen lies nearly destroy her town. Dustfire saved your life by revealing what he really is. Maybe other people deserve the chance to witness that kind of miracle. Behind them, the town was stirring to life under new leadership. With Judge Pierce imprisoned and awaiting trial in the territorial capital, Deadman's Bluff had elected Martha as their temporary magistrate, the first woman to hold such a position in the territory. Sheriff Morrison remained in his post, but with new deputies and a renewed commitment to seeking truth before rushing to judgment. The town's in good hands, Samuel observed. The town learned an important lesson, Martha replied. Sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected sources. As if summoned by her words, Dustfire turned his head toward the hills beyond town, his ears pricked forward with alert attention. Samuel felt it too, a subtle shift in the air, a sense that somewhere out there, injustice was taking root and would need to be confronted. Duty calls, Samuel said, touching his hat brim in farewell. Martha stepped back as they prepared to leave, but her voice followed them. "Samuel, when you write your reports to that federal marshal, make sure you tell the truth about Dustfire, all of it." Samuel nodded, understanding her meaning. The official reports would document their cases, their methods, their successes and failures. But they would also preserve the truth about what Dustfire was and what he represented, proof that intelligence and loyalty and moral courage could exist in forms that humans didn't expect or fully understand. As they rode out of Deadman's Bluff, Samuel reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 4 days. He'd gone from condemned prisoner to federal deputy, from believing he owned a remarkable horse to understanding that he partnered with a remarkable being whose true nature remained beautifully mysterious. The trail ahead stretched across the desert toward Silver Creek, 3 days of hard riding through country where the law was whatever men with guns decided it should be. But Samuel Creek no longer rode alone. He rode with a partner whose intelligence and moral compass had proven superior to those of most humans, whose loyalty ran deeper than blood, and whose commitment to justice had already saved one innocent life. Behind them, Deadman's Bluff settled into its daily routine, forever changed by the events of the past week. The gallows still stood in the town square, but now it served as a reminder rather than a threat, a monument to the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of seeking truth before demanding vengeance. Children playing in the dusty streets would grow up hearing the story of Samuel Creek and his miraculous horse, a tale that would be told and retold until it became legend. Some would dismiss it as frontier folklore, exaggerated in the telling. Others would recognize it as something more profound evidence that the world contained wonders beyond human comprehension, and that sometimes those wonders chose to serve justice when human institutions failed. As the sun climbed higher and Deadman's Bluff faded into the heat shimmer behind them, Samuel felt a deep contentment settle in his chest. He'd found his true calling at last, not as a solitary rancher scratching out a living from hard ground, but as part of a partnership that served something larger than individual ambition or survival. "Well, Dustfire," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "I reckon we've got our work cut out for us." The Mustang's only response was to quicken his pace slightly, as if eager to reach their next destination and whatever challenges awaited them there. But Samuel could have sworn he heard something that sounded remarkably like agreement in the rhythm of those steady hoofbeats. Behind them, the new headstone in Deadman's Bluff Cemetery caught the morning light, its inscription a promise that truth, however long buried, eventually found its way to the surface. And ahead of them, the trail stretched on toward Silver Creek and beyond, toward other towns where justice might need the kind of help that only an extraordinary partnership could provide. Sometimes the bond between a man and his horse truly did run deeper than blood. And sometimes, when everything worth fighting for hung by a thread, that bond proved strong enough to change the world. One town, one life, one act of courage at a time. The frontier was vast, and there was work to be done.